You're listening to the National Secular Society podcast, hosted by Emma Park. In recent years, public attention has been drawn to the plight of adults, terminally ill but mentally competent, who have wanted to die but been unable to do so in Britain because the current laws would make anyone who helped them liable to criminal prosecution. In this podcast, I will be speaking to three different people with particular knowledge and experience of the issues raised by this lack of provision for assisted dying in the UK. Lloyd Riley is Policy and Research Manager at Dignity in Dying, a not-for-profit organisation that campaigns for the legalisation of assisted dying in the UK. Lloyd has recently co-authored a book, Last Rites, The Case for Assisted Dying, which explores the inadequacies of the current legislation and makes the case for change. Mick Murray, who is also a member of Dignity in Dying, had a distressing first-hand experience of the weaknesses of the current law when two of his close friends became terminally ill and were refused the assistance that they sought in this country to enable them to die. I am then joined by Dr. Anthony Lempert, who is a GP and chairs the NSS Medical Forum, to discuss his own experience of religious influence on the assisted dying debate and the arguments for and against changing the law. This podcast contains material that some may find distressing. I'm joined now by Lloyd Riley and Mick Murray from Dignity in Dying. Lloyd, Mick, hello. Would you like to start by introducing yourselves and your organisation?
Thanks for having us, Emma. My name's Lloyd Riley. I'm the Policy and Research Manager at Dignity in Dying. I'm also the co-author of a new book on this issue, Last Rites, The Case for Assisted Dying.
Oh, hello, and thank you for inviting me. And my name's Mick Murray, and I'm retired. I'm a member of Dignity in Dying, but not an office holder. And I've been actively involved in it for a number of years now.
Great, thanks both. So, Lloyd, let's start with you as you're an officer of Dignity in Dying. What is the current state of the law or the laws in different parts of the UK about people who choose to take their own life?
So suicide in this country isn't illegal. That changed when the Suicide Act 1961 came into force in England and Wales. But at the same time, that piece of legislation did criminalise any assistance of people to end their own life, which is where the problems that we'll come on to talk about originated. Scotland and Northern Ireland have similar pieces of legislation. So essentially, across the UK, there is a ban on assisted dying, compassionate assistance to help dying people escape a period of suffering.
And what are the origins of this law? So the Suicide Act obviously stopped suicide from being illegal as it had been before as a matter of, I guess, Christian doctrine. But what are the reasons why in this country assisted dying is currently illegal and the principles behind it?
So as you say, the Suicide Act, I mean, it really was to combat religious stigma around suicide that was having a negative impact on the bereavement of families. I think that was a good thing. In terms of criminalising assistance, I'm sure the intention was protection, but it dates back to 1961. It is fundamentally outdated now and not really fit for the 20th century, let alone the 21st century. So we've seen huge developments in that time, not just in terms of freedoms and autonomy being embedded in wider society, but when it comes to end-of-life care specifically, we have a much more person-centered focus now, and that's completely at odds with this law, which denies dying people a say over how their lives end.
So basically, the law has not been updated to reflect the current state of society.
Absolutely. There was a slight update in terms of the guidance that's been provided to prosecutors around this issue. So when Debbie Purdy won her case, the DPP issued new guidance which made prosecution for people who are acting compassionately less likely. That didn't fix the law by any means. If anything, I think it highlighted how flawed the actual law is and how indefensible the outright ban on assisted dying is.
And Lloyd, just remind listeners, when was the Debbie Purdy case?
So the DPP's guidelines came into force in 2009. So it's a fairly recent update, but as I say, hasn't fixed the laws by any means.
In terms of the problems with the current law, let's have a look at its practical effects on people. Mick, you've had experience of this through two of your friends. Would you like to tell listeners what your experience has been of the problems in the UK with the current law?
My experience with the law is it's a complete mess. It's applied arbitrarily, randomly, and I had to deal with this when the death of my two friends separately in 2014 and 15, both of whom had terminal illnesses and were beyond palliative care, and both of whom wanted to die at home, surrounded by friends and family, but that simply wasn't an option. And therefore they were forced to go to Dignitas. So I helped them to arrange on both occasions to go there. We made no secret of what we were doing, and it was covered eventually on the day itself that my friend died in 2015 by a news reporter from The Sun and by ITV News, who broadcast a whole wide interview. So there's no secret about this. And when we came back after my friends had died on each occasion, we weren't contacted by the police or any enforcement officers. However, that isn't the case with other people who subsequently were hounded or arrested or put under all kinds of interrogation, left wondering for months and months and months whether their case was going to be taken up, and in some cases actually charged for their so-called crimes in acting compassionately. So the law is basically all over the place. I was lucky not to have been touched by it. But there's no saying this is sort of like Russian roulette, I have to say, the way it's applied.
Absolutely. Mick, this is, of course, a very sensitive topic, but if you wouldn't just mind going into a little bit more detail for the listeners. I understand, so your friend Anne Hall, she was suffering from supranuclear palsy, I understand, and Bob Cole, her husband, was suffering from mesothelioma. So did they try to get a remedy in this country before they went abroad?
Yes. Firstly, there's no remedy at all for progressive supranuclear palsy, and it's beyond palliative care. The risk, as it gets worse and worse, and in Annie's case, it was getting really serious. She couldn't stand up. She had to be fed, 24-hour care for. She was still mentally alert, but she was desperate to put an end to it before. The most common cause of death, I think, is from choking on your own tongue because you can't control it. So she was desperate not to have to go through that complete loss of dignity as she died. And my friend Bob, he'd worked as an apprentice joiner. His first job at the age of 15 was sawing up asbestos, and asbestos sits in your lungs for 50 years before it explodes into mesothelioma, and he was in an absolutely desperate state. Morphine patches, swigging morphine pills by the dozen that actually knocked him out, and then the pain just returned till he was screaming, and there was nothing that could be done for him. And in the end, he resolved to go to Dignitas, as his wife had done the year before, and to finish his life. It was just awful. He was like a brother to me. He was only 2 days younger than me, and he always used to call me Dad. So to go with my best friend for over sort of 45 years and to witness this was terrifying. Like this is not unique to me, I have to say. This is a common feature of all of those family members and those nearest and dearest to people who are suffering chronically at the end of life.
Obviously an extremely distressing experience for you, Mick. What did Anne and Bob try to do? How did they try to get assisted dying in this country, and how was it rejected?
Well, there have been a number of cases of people who had tried to do things, their worry was not that they were going to die. Their worry was that the people who were going to be with them as they died, say at a party where they then retired to a room would actually risk prosecution for aiding and abetting a suicide. As Lloyd just pointed out, that it's aiding and abetting a suicide, which is the criminal act, carries a 14-year prison sentence at a maximum. So their only option open to them was to go somewhere to have jurisdiction to export their dying to another country where they could be with friends and make it a positive act, which wasn't criminal in the eyes of, in this case, of Switzerland. So that's the dilemma that people face and that they face themselves in making this choice.
And going to Switzerland, I imagine that can't have been an easy or a cheap process.
It's an extremely complicated process. The massive amount of evidence you have to produce for the Swiss agency and for the Swiss authorities, the booking, and it's all expensive, and the cost of getting to Switzerland and of living, you have to spend a few days there while doctors see you, puts it beyond the reach of an awful lot of people in Britain.
That's totally understandable, Mick. You also mentioned that although you and your friends who helped Anne and Bob were not pursued afterwards, that some people who've had recourse to Dignitas in Switzerland, their relatives who helped them out, have been later pursued.
For example, there was a woman in South Wales who was dying and wanted to raise the money and her daughters wanted to hold a party to raise some money to enable her to go to Switzerland. And they were interviewed by the police and told that they couldn't do that. So there was a case in Chester, I know, of a man who'd told his doctor he was going. The doctor had informed the police, and he wasn't at home, but the police had actually come around and kicked his door in, and later arrested and questioned him before he went. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that other people have been interviewed or left hanging, not knowing whether they would be prosecuted or not. And there was a terrible case recently of Jeff Whaley and his wife Anne, where the police intervened and left a case open for some while before it was eventually dismissed around whether she'd acted in a compassionate way or not. It's a muddle. The whole thing is a complete muddle. And end of life shouldn't be such a mess for people, especially for the people who are dying and for the people who love them dearly.
Sounds like a really inhumane situation that we've got in the law at the moment. And talking about the fact that it feels inhumane, these sorts of cases, what are the principles, what should the moral basis be for governing the way our society approaches death now in the 21st century with science and society being the way they are? Lloyd, you wrote a book about this, which was published in June, which was Last Rites, the Case for Assisted Dying. What do you think the moral basis should be for the way we approach assisted dying?
Well, I think it's clear, as Mick has just movingly highlighted, that the status quo, the current system in the UK, is a complete mess. And I think when it comes to end-of-life care, the culture that we have is still predicated on doctor knows best. Paternalism, essentially. And as we argue in Last Rites, we need to reform that system. We need to make sure that the wishes of the individual who is dying are paramount and that their voices are brought into the centre of this debate. And in terms of other principles, we need to look at justice and equality. Not everyone can afford to go to Dignitas. As Mick said, it's incredibly bureaucratic process, which is justified, as we'll come on to make sure the safeguards are there, but it's difficult to do that and to access that death in Switzerland. Not everybody can travel and is physically capable of making that journey. When we were writing the book, I spoke to a woman called Amanda, and she asked me quite bluntly, why is it acceptable that we force dying people to starve and dehydrate themselves to death? She asked me that because that's exactly what her dad had done and that she'd witnessed her dad do. He was a professor in pain management, an incredibly eminent healthcare professional. He was dying in the end stages of Parkinson's disease. And he knew that was the only way that he could control his death and his final weeks. Amanda said that over the 2 weeks that it took to die, when he was refusing food and water, she went to visit him, found him walking up and down the corridors of where he was being cared for with a Zimmer frame. She asked what he was doing, and he said he was trying to burn extra calories to accelerate the process. Now, I don't know how anyone can defend a system that forces people into those situations, that completely abandons people like Bob and Annie and forces them to seek a peaceful death overseas. So I think we really do need quite a widespread overhaul and a reform of the existing culture around end-of-life care.
Mick, do you have anything to add to that?
Life is about life should be celebrated, but we need to get to the point where we actually celebrate and take death as part of life and treat it positively. And I think that comes out absolutely wonderfully in the book that's just been published last Rights. And for anyone who hasn't read it, I think they need to.
Thank you, Mick. Now let's talk about specifically, given that the current situation is so utterly inhumane and just a complete mess, as you both have been saying, how are we going to reform it? How should this country reform the situation? Dignity in Dying, your organisation, advocates the legalisation of assisted dying. Could you explain what this means and how you would see assisted dying being implemented in practice?
Yeah, so we want to make sure that dying people aren't abandoned, that they have the option not to suffer against their wishes, so that they have the option to die in this country at home, surrounded by their friends, family members. I mentioned Amanda and her dad. She said that his wish was for his family members to have a glass of champagne while he delivered his final words of wisdom. And I know that people like Bob are able to do that, but they shouldn't have had to travel to Switzerland in order to have that kind of death. So we want legislation in this country. We want to change the law. An assisted dying law, it would give dying adults who have mental capacity the option of requesting an assisted death. So essentially a dose of medication that can be prescribed that would allow them to end their lives in the manner and the timing of their choosing. This would be much more transparent than the current law. There'd be much more safeguards. They would all be upfront safeguards. Mick talked about police investigations after the fact. They don't protect people, but the safeguards of an assisted dying law would. And it would ensure that people like Mick aren't at risk of prosecution by trying to support their friends to have a peaceful death. It would mean that people aren't forced to take matters into their own hands or have to worry about doing that. For the vast majority of people, it would act as an insurance policy. They'd know that they wouldn't be forced to suffer against their wishes if they were in that situation. We know, and we make a clear case in the book, that end-of-life care in this country is of a high quality and it should be better. It should have more funding. But even the very best end-of-life care can't guarantee people a peaceful death. There need to be further options.
What about people who are mentally incapacitated? Because you said that you're specifically focusing on adults who have the mental capacity to choose to die. But what about the case of people, say, who have been in a long-term coma? Is there a solution for them?
So assisted dying legislation, for us, a key safeguard is mental capacity, because this is all about autonomy and people being able to make choices for themselves. So in terms of assisted dying, that's crucial for us. We also have a sister organisation called Compassion in Dying, which is doing great work encouraging and supporting people to plan ahead under the current law. So people have the legal right to refuse treatment, and they can document their wishes in an advance decision, also known as a living will, so that if someone were to find themselves in those kind of circumstances you mentioned, like a coma, then they would have some control over the decisions that were made about their care. And people can also appoint somebody else that they trust to make those decisions too, with a power of attorney. So those things are really important. And I think, these issues aren't unrelated. I think this is all about a culture of end-of-life care where people are encouraged to think about these issues.
Now, there are a few countries in the Western world where assisted dying is already legal, or at least decriminalised. Mick mentioned Switzerland, where it's decriminalised. It's actually legal in Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Oregon in the US. What is the practical procedure for assisted dying in those countries, and how well has it worked so far?
The practical procedure in Switzerland is that you enrol with Dignitas from Britain, you become a member, You write then a CV to them of your illness, and if they agree that it looks as though they will take you on board for assisted dying, they then set in hand a whole number of inquiries that you have to make, which include your full medical records, proof of address, dental records for identity, and so on and so on and so on, a host of stuff. By the way, assembling some of that is not easy, because doctors, and as soon as they know this is for Switzerland, are thrown into something what they call an ethical dilemma around, are they actually supporting or helping to support an assisted suicide. So there's not universal practice from doctors in providing records, for example. So, and then you're again going to a conversation with Dignitas when you've got this far, and they agree that they can offer you a date, and you then go, you accept that, you go to Switzerland, and then you have to be seen on 2 separate days by a doctor who quizzes you without anybody else there as to whether this is a definite decision, which makes an assessment of your mental competence, makes an assessment of whether they feel you're being pressured into this or not. And in the end, if they're satisfied, the doctor, then they can actually write the prescription for the terminal drug to be granted to Dignitas. And you then go on day 3 to the place where you're going to die. And you self-administer the drug, which is really important. This is not euthanasia. The doctors are not involved in giving you a terminal injection, as they are, by the way, in some other countries within Europe. So there are different practices, but Swiss is would be self-administered. And I think that's the model which we're advocating for Britain as well, by the way, or for England and Wales.
Is that difficult? I mean, what if someone is paralysed, but they have full mental capacity?
If someone's paralysed, rather than, there are 2 ways that I know that you could take the drug. One would be you're asked to swallow it, but in the case where swallowing is extremely difficult, they actually and this happened with Annie, they put a cannula into her arm, and she just simply pressed a button. Now, if you're severely disabled and can't move, I'm not sure that you would be able to meet the self-administered, or whether there is a technique. I simply don't know.
Yeah, we do know that there are different devices that can be set up so that people can take the final act themselves to trigger a syringe driver, as Mick mentioned. I think the other thing to say is that we know from the experiences of people who access assisted dying in these jurisdictions is that they are wanting to avoid the final weeks of their illness, and would be more likely to make use of this option before they got to that point where they physically weren't able to have an assisted death. So, for example, motor neurone disease is a neurological condition which leads to people becoming physically less able to move, and ultimately can lead to paralysis. In Oregon, people with motor neuron disease, or ALS as it's called in America, do access the law, but they tend to do so before they reach that point.
Right. So it's all about giving people a chance to plan ahead.
Exactly. Yeah. Once that option is on the table, then it gives people a chance to think through what they would like for themselves.
Mick, so your experience of Switzerland with your 2 dear friends, how well do you think that their procedures work? Would you want the same thing in this country?
Well, I think the safeguards which are being advocated here by Dignity in Dying are actually, if anything, much stronger than those in Switzerland. So, for example, there would be a High Court judge or a judge-led decision as to ensure that you weren't being pressured into making this choice. There would have to be 2 doctors who agreed that you were within 6 months of dying. There would have to be doctors, not the same doctors maybe, but separately, who would have to say that you were compos mentis. So, in fact, the proposal here is more watertight, it seems to me, even than the one in Switzerland. and that's pretty good. I would say I came away feeling very confident about that, and I would certainly feel confident about the procedures. And I can't think of anything that could be added to these kinds of procedures to make it more secure for people, particularly those who are elderly or vulnerable or what have you.
So, Lloyd, could you just maybe add to Mick's point about how and why your safeguards would be implemented?
Well, obviously, safeguards against abuse are crucial. Doctors would assess someone's capacity and whether they are being coerced. There'd be the option of speaking to a psychiatrist or psychologist, counsellor for mental health support if that was felt necessary. And it's important as well to note that these are safeguards that exist under the current law. So I mentioned Amanda's dad earlier. You know, that his care team, it's a legal choice to refuse food and water, but his care team had to assess whether he was being coerced or pressured into that decision. So this wouldn't be a radical step into the dark for healthcare professionals. They're used to making these assessments on a day-to-day basis. But I think it's an interesting point around family members, because I think it sheds light on a battle that we have to take part in as campaigners, that the case for assisted dying is based on evidence of the failures of the current law in this country, which, you know, Mick has first-hand experience of, and evidence of the safe practice of a compassionate alternative that is working around the world. The case against assisted dying relies on fear and speculation and hypothetical arguments, which just aren't backed up by the evidence. I had an exchange on Twitter with a quite high-profile end-of-life care academic who tweeted something about an association between assisted dying leading to an increase in suicide rates. And there's not a shred of evidence for that. In fact, any studies that have set out to prove that have actually found the opposite. But when I pointed this out, there's no remorse about the fact that they were spreading misinformation. These tactics shouldn't have any place whatsoever in debates about what healthcare options should be available to dying people. So I think the point about safeguards and the objections that are often put forward really does need to be examined, and people need to realise that we have evidence to back up our case, but there's not the evidence to back up these objections that are being put forward.
Could I add to that? Because I learned today from The Independent, today is end of September, that the Pope has reaffirmed the Catholic Church's position on assisted suicide, which he is now, quote, intrinsically evil, end quote, and those who participate in it are guilty of homicide. So I learned today that actually I'm guilty, not just intrinsically evil, but I'm also guilty of homicide. And this is the kind of, if you like, scaremongering or pressure which is brought to bear through vested interests who actually often disguise who they are and where they're coming from. And the second thing I wanted to say is where there are states which have one form or another of assisted dying in place, there has not been a mass thing to show that it's led to all the kinds of things which Lloyd has just refuted. You know, the scaremongering that's gone on in all of these countries, however much they differ, their systems have worked and seem to be fairly watertight in terms of abuse and so on. And so I think that's really, really important, because the opposition, the people who are opposing this, haven't gone away in those countries. And if they could find a single way of reverting to previous legislation, they would. But so far, they've not been able to. I think that's really important.
Yeah, so basically you're saying that the positions that opponents are taking are based on lack of knowledge, based on fear, and often based on religious motives, as Mick, you mentioned the Pope. And that moves on to my next question, which is that it's not only Catholics, but I think many religious organisations would argue that assisted dying is a threat to their religious freedom, or that it's wrong for their religious basis. Lloyd, what is your response to that?
So most people support, most religious people or people who identify as religious do support assisted dying and our campaign. So I think we need to draw a distinction between the vast majority of religious people and the organisations that represent them. Our legislation does include a conscientious objection clause. So any healthcare professional that did have a religious objection wouldn't need to be involved in this if they didn't want to. Of course, anybody who personally disagrees with assisted dying doesn't have to have an assisted death. This wouldn't affect them in any way. But as Mick's just said, the Vatican came out and said this practice is intrinsically evil. I think the minority of religious people that oppose this already have very powerful people speaking up for them. In terms of freedom, I'm more concerned about the freedom of dying people in this country who are forced into circumstances where they are going to suffer against their wishes simply because people are willing to impose their belief on them. So that's where I think freedom plays a role in the debate.
What other religious organisations have made public statements in opposition to assisted dying?
So the last time we had legislation in Parliament, the Archbishop of Canterbury did make a public intervention and warned MPs not to change the law. Again, I think the arguments that he put forward were based on scaremongering. I would have liked to have seen, if he was really being honest, that it was religious doctrine that was influencing that position. And I think, that belief should be respected, and I have no problem with people personally objecting to law change because of their religious beliefs. But as Mick said, I don't think it's acceptable that people can hide behind much weaker arguments in order to make that case.
You say that many religious people support assisted dying. Do you have any statistics on that?
Yeah, so the largest poll that we've ever done on assisted dying that's ever been done, over 5,000 people, found that public support is at 84%. Religious support is just as high as that, over 80%. Disability support, that's often an argument that's put forward that disabled people might be scared of a change in legislation, even though it wouldn't affect them unless there was a terminal illness present. Support amongst disabled people is also over 80%. And these figures have been consistent for decades. The public appetite for a change in the law is really unquestionable. And the problem that we've got is that hasn't yet filtered through to MPs, but things are changing on that front too.
What about groups with specialist knowledge, such as the Royal College of Physicians, the British Medical Association, or psychologists?
Yes, I mentioned the Archbishop of Canterbury's intervention in 2015 when there was a bill in Parliament. The opinion of medical organisations, such as the ones you've mentioned, was also key in leading MPs to vote against that bill. That has changed, though, in the last 5 years, primarily because those organisations have gone out to their members and carried out surveys on this issue and found that they don't actually have a mandate to oppose a change in the law. So those bodies have been forced to adopt more neutral positions. So the Royal College of Physicians, the Royal College of Nursing, Royal College of Psychiatrists, the Faculty of Clinical Oncologists, which represents cancer doctors, have all committed not to stand in the way of law change. The British Medical Association, its survey results are due soon, so we'll be able to see from that exactly where doctors stand. Over 29,000 doctors responded to that, so that will really give us an insight into where they are at the moment. But I think it's undeniable that there's been a shift. But I think it's also key to remember that in terms of groups that have specialist knowledge, the people who know most about this issue are dying people and their families. Which is why we argue in Last Rites that it's their voices that need to be brought into the centre of this debate. We need to hand the microphone over to them and listen less to doctors, who obviously have an important role to play in the debate.
And just a final question for both of you, Lloyd and Mick. In your experience, what has the pandemic revealed to us about our society's attitudes to death, and in particular to the topic of assisted dying? Do you think the experience of the coronavirus has helped us as a society to grow up?
The answer is, I would like to think that it's helped us to move on. Our attitude to death has been not spectacular, has it? But it's become more, the issue is now more and more out in the open. And I think the evidence of, certainly in the last 5 or 10 years, has been that people have begun to shake off all those sort of fears of death and begun to talk about it in a quite a different way. Things like, for example, death cafes have cropped up here, there, and everywhere, where people actually want to talk about the issues. And it's not just here, it's bubbling away all over the place, not just in England. You know, there are issues around Isle of Man, Jersey and Guernsey around us. Scotland is very much to the fore around death, dying, assisted dying, and so on. And the central fundamental point here, which I think is that this is about freedom of choice. This is one of the last great barriers of choice being exercised by individuals in the face and the teeth of opposition from the usual vested interests, I have to say. And this debate is going on across Europe, across states in Australia. Tasmania's now launching something there. So it's an issue which is of its time. And the COVID thing, I think, will accelerate some of that thinking.
Lloyd, would you agree?
Yeah, I think Mick's completely right in terms of people are capable of having these conversations. I think we often underestimate dying people in this country. I bring it back to the end of life culture. I think there's still a tendency for doctors maybe not to present opportunities to have conversations about people's wishes. And it's interesting that in jurisdictions that do have assisted dying laws, the end of life culture more broadly has benefited. People are more confident in raising the topic of death and dying, and there's a much more acceptance that it's the quality of life that should be valued more over the quantity of life. In terms of the pandemic, we argue in the book that what society has been through is comparable to what dying people endure every day. So the shock of a diagnosis, the rapidly trying to adapt to a new way of life, and then now moving forward into an uncertain future. So in a way, I think death and dying has become everybody's business. And the more we think about how we want our lives to end, I think the more we'll realize that the rules and the laws which govern that ending are completely out of date and no longer fit for purpose.
Lloyd Riley and Mick Murray, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm joined now by Dr. Anthony Lempert. Anthony is chair of the Secular Medical Forum of the NSS and a GP, and he's going to give us some comment from the secularist perspective on my interview with Mick and Lloyd. Anthony, good morning.
Good morning.
First of all, Mick and Lloyd were quite critical, I think, of doctors, saying that they thought the medical profession was behind the times. And they were also talking quite a lot about the underhand influence of religion on both the BMA, the British Medical Association, and on public attitudes or the process of legislation of assisted dying. So perhaps could you start by telling us about, do you agree? Do you think there's a lot of underhand influence by religious groups or religious individuals on the resistance to assisted dying legislation?
I think it's a really valid point, both about the resistance within the medical profession, although I do believe that's changing to some degree, but certainly the underhand element. I think, firstly, you can't talk about the underhand element without actually talking about what we know already that is happening right in front of our eyes. The fact is that religion is given a prominent place in our society. We have bishops in the House of Lords who have influenced debate. We have deference to religion. These pervade our society and influence debates, whether we like it or not. In terms of the underhand element, I think there's increasing evidence that a lot of the debates around assisted dying, if you listen to the language, particularly over the last 20 odd years, you'll hear a distinct shift. And the shift has gone from people overtly claiming that life is sacred and the sanctity of life must be respected, and that it's God's will to let us live and die as long as we do, and not to interfere with it, to a much more framed debate, where people talk about vulnerability and slippery slopes and all sorts of other issues and being able to alleviate suffering. And this is quite a deliberate ploy. I mean, there's actually people have written, some religious people have actually written articles on it, advising religious people not to use religious language. And it's certainly something I've witnessed, certainly at the BMA, where I sit as a representative, although I'm not speaking as a representative here. And certainly in the debates, it's quite often you will find that people will not use religious language when they are discussing it. I think it's important to recognise that this is not about a debate about whether you're religious or not, because the majority of religious people are also in favour of assisted dying. It's more a question of the tactics employed by religious bodies and the people who claim to represent those religious people. Which of course is at odds, as Lloyd rightly said, over 80% of the population have consistently been in favour of assisted dying, and a large portion of religious people, and yet the religious bodies themselves, and as Mick so eloquently pointed out, what the Pope said just the other week, where he condemned assisted dying as evil.
Yeah. So what you're saying is it's religious figureheads and influential people, say in the BMA, who happen to be religious, rather than religious people in general.
Yes, and will often use their religion and will use their position, and sometimes will put themselves in that position deliberately so that they can influence the debate.
So you've been saying that, in the early 2000s, we may have had bishops in the House of Lords talking about the sanctity of life, but the debate, the framing of the debate has changed, and now people who are on who oppose assisted dying maybe speak in terms of the problems with assisted dying. Now, Mick and Lloyd were talking about the fear-mongering aspect, that they say it's a slippery slope, but you also mentioned the issue of suffering, the alleviation of suffering, and they would argue, the opponents of assisted dying would now say that it is possible to alleviate the suffering of people who are terminally ill sufficiently. Do you think that's a reasonable argument?
I think it's wholly unreasonable, and I think anyone who's worked in palliative care, and obviously as a GP I do personally, but many relatives, most people have got experience of witnessing a relative or a friend die, and often it's done very well. And I'm not knocking the care that's given, but it is frankly impossible to alleviate all forms of suffering for all people. And pain is one element of it, but is one that often gets focused on again and again when people say, oh, they want, in countries where people are having an assisted death, the opponents often say, oh, they weren't even in pain. Well, it's like, well, nausea, vomiting, psychological pain, the terror of dying with certain conditions. These are all forms of suffering, and not all of them are manageable by drugs or support or love. A lot of these people are deeply loved and deeply supported, and I think that's one of the most unpleasant aspects of the claims, when people say if only these people had more love around them, they wouldn't want to die. I think some people will suffer. They're surrounded with loved ones who actually want them to live. And they actually think that actually they can't bear to live anymore. They want to live themselves, but they can't bear to live the way they are living.
You have a particular interest in this issue, partly because you were the expert witness on the Tony Nicholson case in 2012. And just to remind listeners, Tony Nicholson had locked-in syndrome. So could you maybe tell us a bit about how that experience has shaped your support for the assisted dying legislation?
Well, certainly. I mean, it was quite a new experience for me. I became involved mainly through my role in the Secular Medical Forum. Tony was someone who was a very active, vibrant man, and I should say he gave permission. He wanted his story to be told. He went very public at the time. He woke up one morning literally only able to blink his eyes, and in times gone by, people may have thought that he wasn't able to think or communicate. But fortunately, with modern technology, he was able to communicate with me, with his wife, and eventually he had an iBlink computer, which meant that he could have complete conversations. I met him a couple of times, as part of the role as expert witness. And Tony expressed to me how his one abiding fear was that he didn't want to have to starve himself to death or dehydrate himself, because his only way of communicating was via iBlink. And if he became unconscious, then he would no longer be able to communicate. The reality is that he didn't want to die. He wasn't ready to die. He wanted the option of having it in his back pocket for the time when he could no longer bear the suffering that he had on a daily basis. And what actually happened was that he lost his High Court case in August 2012, and 7 or 8 days later, he died because he had no longer, he took the only option that was open to him at that point, and he took no food or water at that time, since that time. And for me, that was it was a terrible tragedy, because talking to Tony, I have to say, sitting in the room with him, after being there half an hour, I had forgotten that we were communicating through an Ivy-Link computer. His brain was so sharp, he was so vibrant, so he wasn't in the slightest bit depressed. He was miserable with his circumstances. But some of these arguments keep coming out with opponents of assisted dying. They say, well, these people are depressed, or these people they just need to explore this, they just need to explore that. And the reality is that if anyone had gone through every single possible option open to him, Tony certainly had. And I don't think anyone should have had to suffer what he had to suffer.
So basically, I mean, from this perspective, the law is just inhumane because people, it takes away patient autonomy, and it prevents people who know very clearly what they want from doing what they need to do. And there was no other option for Tony. Yes,
and patient autonomy is widely regarded as probably the most fundamental medical ethic. And if we think about it, it's fairly obvious why. We all want to make decisions that are right for us. I think going way back, the important medical ethic was beneficence. So doctors did what's best for the patient. Well, that's all well and good, but sometimes patients don't want what the doctor thinks is best. And nowadays it's really strongly recognised that patients should be intimately involved in all aspects of their care, and they're allowed to make decisions that are unwise.
Such as Jehovah's Witnesses who can refuse a blood transfusion.
Precisely. If we believe that they've understood the question and have weighed it up and have come to their conclusion that they don't want a blood transfusion, even if that might save their life, then it's not my job as a doctor to override their opinion and their views, and it's their right to choose that particular course of action. And I think that should be extended to all aspects of our lives, including the end of life.
So it seems like the end of life is a sort of strange exception to the general principle of patient autonomy. The NSS position is that the NSS is neither for nor against assisted dying legislation as such. It merely wants to ensure that the debate is not influenced inappropriately by religion. So just looking at the position of opponents to assisted dying, I mean, I think one argument they make, which is not based on religion as such, is patient vulnerability. They would say, well, what about patients who are very vulnerable and they might be perhaps influenced by their relatives to take their own life when it wouldn't be appropriate for them to do so? How strong is this argument?
I think patient vulnerability is an extremely important point, and one that must be discussed by both opponents and by anyone who's discussing this debate. The argument for those who are against assisted dying is often that patients feel under pressure. They might feel under undue pressure, both by relatives, but even wider than that, by society. I don't think we can dismiss that argument. I think it's an important point to make that that some people might be swayed by that. I do think the vulnerability argument is way, way bigger than that, though, on two fronts. The number one is that the most vulnerable person in this situation is the person who is so desperate with the state of their life and what's going to come in their life, that they are asking for an assisted death, because the very fact they're asking for it tells me that it screams out the word vulnerability to suffering, if nothing else. And the other question is the vulnerability that exists in the current situation, because the current law, and as both Lloyd and Mick said, it's a mess. It was described by the Falconer Commission in 2010 as inadequate and incoherent. And there's a reason for that, because currently it's legal to commit suicide, but it's illegal to assist someone to commit suicide. However, the only time the determination is made is after the patient has died, which means that there is no safeguard in place whatsoever for assessing someone who might be vulnerable to coercion, who might actually be amenable to further treatment, if only they felt the door was open for them to come to their doctor and say, look, I'm wanting an assisted death. That doctor would not go, oh, yeah, that's fine, we'll just sign it here. What they would say is, what are the problems? What are the issues? We'd spend an enormous amount of time trying to work out how we might help. But also, at the end of the day, if we can't, if there was a law, we could then set that process in motion. Well, currently, that's completely absent from the debate. So there will be, I suspect it's a few people, but there will be a few vulnerable to an unscrupulous relative who then claims afterwards that they're acting out of love and compassion and in accordance with their relative's wishes, which is what the DPP in 2010, in response to the Debbie Purdy legal challenge, stated would be mitigating factors, whereas a doctor who assists someone to die would go in the other direction. They'd be more likely to be prosecuted.
So doctors, in a way, are particularly in a very difficult position because at the moment you can't assist someone at all who wants to die. And what is the situation now?
Well, the GMC is very clear that if a patient comes to us asking for an assisted death, we must explain to them that it is a criminal offence. And the GMC very kindly says that we may feel challenged in ensuring that patients don't feel abandoned. Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely, because quite a lot of patients, what we rely on, and certainly as a GP, is the doctor-patient relationship. And that needs honesty on both parts. And if someone's coming to me saying they want to die, and all I can say to them is, it's a criminal offence for me to help you. Of course, I'll discuss the other issues as well, but they won't come to me in the first place because they know I can't do it. That's a barrier to communication. And a lot of GPs are very frustrated by that. In 2019, the Royal College of GPs did their most recent poll of GPs on the subject of assisted dying. This followed the 2013 poll, which had a very small number of respondents, showing about 2/3 of GPs were against a change in the law. Well, there's been a radical shift from that number to there are now more GPs who are either in favour of neutrality or permitting assisted dying than there are the 47% of GPs who remain opposed to assisted dying. Unfortunately, at the moment, the Royal College of GPs has decided to stick with its current opposition, which I understand is facing a legal challenge at the moment.
And why is that?
I don't know the politics of the Royal College of GPs. I don't know whether there's religious influence. What I do know is that a lot of people who are against assisted dying, who are not religious, just say, well, I'm against it, I wouldn't take part in it, but you do what you want. Whereas a lot of the religious bodies say, well, I'm against it and I don't want anybody to do it because it breaks my faith. And that's one of the biggest difficulties, is that people can be for or against personally, but why stop other people? If there was a law, it absolutely would protect anybody from having assisted dying done to them, because that wouldn't be assisted dying, that would be murder.
So the point you're making is that religious opponents to assisted dying are not content to just oppose it in their own case. They want to impose their view on everyone else.
That's correct, yes. And they will often do it by using scare tactics and giving misinformation. And as I said before, by framing it in a different way so that it sounds plausible.
Dr. Anthony Lempert, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Emma.
This episode was produced by the National Secular Society, all rights reserved. The views expressed by contributors do not necessarily represent those of the NSS. You can access the show notes and subscriber information for this and all our episodes at secularism.org.uk/podcast. For feedback, comments and suggestions, please email podcast@secularism.org.uk. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you can. Thanks for listening, and I hope you can join us next time.